Hi and welcome to this video on the theories of evolution and speciation, which is for biology triple students only. Now just to recap, evolution is a change in the inherited characteristics of a population over time, and this has always been observed mainly through fossil evidence. However, it was more difficult to explain how evolution and how this change actually happened. A French scientist called Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was born in 1744 and lived through to 1829, theorised that changes acquired during an organism's lifetime would be passed on to the offspring, especially if a characteristic was used a lot. It will become more developed. So, if you were an Olympic swimmer, for example, doing the butterfly stroke, you will use your arm muscles a lot, and you are likely to develop or acquire broader shoulders during your lifetime. If Jean-Baptiste's theory was true, the offspring of such an athlete would be born with those broad shoulders. Now, we know that isn't technically true and doesn't actually happen. Charles Darwin, several years later, came up with a theory of survival of the fittest, also known as natural selection, to explain the driving force of these changes in characteristics of a population over time. He recognised the wide variation in a species and the constant competition between individuals of a species for food, mates, shelter, etc. Those with the best adaptations to gain access to these resources and therefore outcompete their rivals ended up surviving and reproducing and therefore passing on these advantageous characteristics to their offspring. So to compare these two theories, we could look at the evolution of an animal such as a giraffe. Now, Lamarck would explain it like this. Small-legged, short-necked giraffe-like ancestors would feed on trees. These trees would be relatively low to the ground, more like a bush. Climate change happened and the trees became taller. So the giraffe needed to therefore stretch its neck and its legs to gain access to this higher food. The stretched neck acquired during the first giraffe's lifetime was passed on to the offspring of that giraffe, which happened to be born with a slightly longer neck and slightly longer legs. This giraffe would still have had to stretch during its lifetime to gain access to food, and as it grew up, its neck would grow longer and longer and longer, so would its legs, and it will pass on those acquired characteristics to its offspring, which would be this third giraffe here, and as that offspring grew up, it again stretched. Now, Darwin, on the other hand, would explain the evolution of the giraffe in a different way. He would have said with a giraffe-like ancestral population, remember this is a group of organisms of the same species, there was variation in the giraffe's neck and leg lengths. Some giraffes had longer legs, some had longer necks than others, etc. If their food source became slightly out of reach, those with the longest legs and neck would be more likely to reach the food that is, feed on it and grow to a reproductive age, and therefore pass on these advantageous characteristics to their offspring. So how does a new species form? The process of the formation of a new species is called speciation, and it starts with a population of a species living in an area such as a main island. Within that population, there naturally is variation. In this case, there's variation in the neck and leg length of these giant tortoises. Many, many years later, due to continental drift, this main island may have broken up into two smaller islands, and those two smaller islands would drift away from each other. The water between the two islands formed a geographical barrier. Now, in speciation, it isn't always water that's a geographical barrier. It could be something like mountains or an area in a rainforest that has been deforested, separating a large rainforest into two smaller rainforests. Now, this island here may have drifted in the direction of the equator, and as a result, it became quite hot and dry, and this affected the vegetation that grew on the island, so the ground was mainly quite sandy. The other island didn't go as close to the equator, and as a result, it was subjected to quite a temperate climate, and this allowed a lot of rainfall, which allowed a lot of green vegetation to cover the land. Going back to this island, because the vegetation couldn't grow close to the ground, any trees that could bear leaves would grow a little bit higher. So the food was higher up, whereas on the more temperate island there was lots of grass to eat, which was close to the ground. Now, in terms of the giant tortoises that have separated out onto these islands, the giant tortoises on the hot and dry island that had the longer necks and legs were able to reach this food that was higher up, and as a result these guys were able to survive, reach reproductive age and pass on those advantageous genes to their offspring. The other guy here, which has a shorter neck and legs, was not able to reach the food that was higher up and therefore got outcompeted by the other type or the other variation of the giant tortoise. And eventually this one would have died out. Whereas on the temperate island, the long-necked variety of the giant tortoise, even though it's perfectly adapted to reach food that was higher up, it didn't have food that was higher up on this island. The island was covered in grass, which is close to the ground, and actually the ones with the shorter legs and shorter neck were better adapted to gain access to that food, and they outcompeted the longer-necked variety. So these would have eventually died off. Now, the offspring of the type or variation of giant tortoise that was left on each island over generation and generation and generation would have changed slightly. And if we then took a long-necked giant tortoise from the dry island and tried to make it breed with the short-necked variety from the greener island, if they got to a point where they were perhaps able to produce an offspring, so a baby tortoise, but that baby tortoise, when it grew up to reproductive age, was actually infertile, then we could say that from the original ancestral population of these giant tortoises where there was variation, these descendants, and we are talking many generations later, as they were no longer able to successfully interbreed to produce fertile offspring, had now separated into two different species. And that is what speciation is. Now, a typical exam question might look at this concept in a particular context. So if we take Darwin's finches, for example, he's very famous for his studies on the different types of finch that he found on a collection of islands just off the coast of South America called the Galapagos Islands. He noted that, and this is when he was coming up with a theory of evolution by natural selection, that on each island, the finches, even though all finches are quite similar, on each island the finches had very, very distinctive beak shapes, and they seemed to match the food source that was available on the island. So this bird here has quite a large beak, shaped very much like a Brazil nut cracker. So the kind of seeds that were on this island were the very large seeds that you would need a nutcracker type machine to actually open up, and the beaks of these finches was perfectly adapted to eat that food source. This bird here had a very long and pointy, very dainty beak, which made it useless at opening up large nuts like Brazil nuts. However, it was really, really good at probing into termite mounds and collecting insects like termites, and this bird here had a beak perfectly adapted to eat smaller seeds. So a typical exam question might ask you to describe how these 4 different variations of finches found on 4 different Galapagos Islands could have speciated. And a model answer would go along the lines of that there is variation already in the beak shape of the ancestral population that may have been found together on the mainland. When part of this mainland broke off into different islands, which were geographically isolated from each other by water. And although finches do fly, the climate around the Galapagos Islands means that there's very strong winds. And if these finches were to try and fly off their island, they wouldn't get very far before the strong winds blew them back onto their island and often blew them into the rocks. So the birds are kind of used to not flying away from their island at all. Being isolated on these islands, eventually the environmental conditions changed and different food became available on each island. Those that naturally had the best adapted beak shape for the food source were able to survive. They reproduced and they passed on this beak shape, or the genes or alleles for the beak shape, to their offspring. Many generations later, if 2 different finches from 2 different islands were brought back together and they couldn't successfully interbreed to produce fertile offspring, that means that speciation would have occurred. One last point to make in this video is that Charles Darwin got a lot of credit for a theory that wasn't just his. In fact, he did a lot of collaborative work with a chap called Alfred Wallace. Now, Darwin went to a group of islands called the Galapagos Islands, which I've just mentioned, but Wallace came up with exactly the same theory of natural selection, but he went to a group of islands in Indonesia, and he made similar observations to Darwin. The problem was, Darwin was clever enough to publish his book, The Origin of Species, before Wallace had the opportunity to actually publish his findings. Wallace is better known for his studies on warning coloration and mimicry. And using the same descriptions as Darwin, if we took a green caterpillar here and compared it to a red caterpillar, maybe at one stage they had shared a common ancestor and there was variations in the coloration of the caterpillars. The green caterpillar is obviously better camouflage, and as a result of blending in onto the background of a leaf, is less likely to be predated on. Therefore, you would imagine it would outcompete its red rival, because the red rival, the red caterpillar here, is more conspicuous, more easily seen. But what he did notice is actually some of these red caterpillars had a really bitter taste or were in fact poisonous. So somewhere down the line they had mutated to have this bitter taste or have this poison. And as a result, a predator like a bird would pick one up and eat it, and either not feel very well as a result, or could in fact die if it was severely poisonous. And as a result, those birds would learn to avoid eating these red caterpillars. But what Wallace noticed that was even more remarkable is that there were other non-bitter or non-poisonous red insects. And the sheer fact that they were the same colour as the poisonous bitter-tasting varieties meant that they didn't get eaten either. They probably would have tasted quite good to a predator like a bird, but the bird would not take a risk on something that could be poisonous and looked poisonous. So by mimicking other red insects, they were able to survive and reproduce and pass on those coloration genes. So Wallace observed that there was variation in the coloration and the taste of these insects, those that were best adapted to avoid being eaten, either by being camouflaged, having a bitter taste, or being poisonous, or just looking like ones that had a bitter taste or were poisonous. These guys were able to survive, and they were able to reproduce and pass on these advantageous genes to their offspring over many, many generations, especially if there was isolation between these subgroups. Eventually, more and more changes would have occurred, so that if you remove the geographical barrier, allowed the subgroups to try and interbreed again, if they couldn't produce fertile offspring, they had separated into different species and they would have speciated. So that covers some theories of evolution and speciation. Do check in again soon.